This is Carl Weinshank for the Daily Music Break. Today we have the real pleasure of speaking with Philip Clark. Philip is the author of the recently released biography, Dave Brubeck, A Life in Time, and it's getting just great reviews. So first of all, thank you very much for joining us, and congratulations on writing. But how long did it take you to write, by the way?
Well, thank you, and it's nice to be with you. It took me about, well, the actual sort of sitting down to write was about 2 years, but then there was sort of 20 years worth of, if not longer, sort of thinking about Dave's music and obsessively collecting records and comparing different performances. So it's a sort of, it's a sort of lifetime's book really. But the actual sort of sitting at the desk, I took about 2 years.
Well, that it must be kind of nerve-wracking waiting for the reviews to come in after spending so much time.
It's a curious one because before this I was a music journalist, and I was the guy on the other side kind of dishing it out.
Right.
And and to have it come the other way was quite strange. But actually, I thought might be a few people with scores to settle. But actually, with a few exceptions, the reviews have been really good. Sort of, they're very understanding, they're very insightful. So I mean, it's been great. It's been a great experience.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
I began reading Brubeck's bio in Wikipedia, and it seemed almost to me like it was a bio of a classical musician or a math genius. I was lost immediately. Generally, it takes me a couple of paragraphs before I'm lost, but I was lost immediately. Can you explain how what is called, at least in this bio, quote, unusual time signatures, as well as superimposing contrasting rhythms, meters, and tonalities, close quote, is reflected kind of in what we hear? Explain that to a layperson, or is it akin to really describing a color of paint by its chemical makeup? It's accurate, but you really just have to look at the color or listen to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, of course, and lots of sort of questions are sort of are compressed within there. But I mean, the thing that Dave was really interested in, and this sort of cuts across, his use of harmony and his use of time, was having different things overlap and allowing sort of making space of the things that ordinarily wouldn't be in the same sort of musical space. Allowing those things space to kind of argue it out and to be sometimes they're not even to be reconciled, but just to sort of cohabit in the same space and sort of sort of feed off the energy of each other. And in terms of time signatures, he felt very strongly that the bebop guys, sort of Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Max Roach, Thelonious Monk had done had sort of really sort of pushed the language of jazz and in terms of harmony from the swing era and classic jazz. They'd really kind of discovered all these kind of sub clauses in harmony and incredibly sort of intricate harmonic relationships they could build their tunes over. And he simply asked at the question, why has nobody done this in terms of meter? Because probably 99.9% of bebop performances are in 4. There might be the occasional waltz, but basically they're all in 4. So Dave simply asked that question, why hasn't this happened with a meter? And in his mind, he was he studied with the great composer Darius Milhaud, who was a French a composer who had sort of been around in Paris in the early years of the 20th century, and had sort of heard Stravinsky and Ravel and Debussy and all these composers who had worked with different sort of time signatures, asymmetrical time signatures. So there was that, and also he had a record of African music from the Congo, different sort of drum beats, And listening to that, he realized that, whereas, a Western music, if it's in a, if it's in a four, it's, it's in a very sort of clear four, and the beats are kind of drop the way you expect them. But in African music, there's all these kind of overlapping beats, that kind of, that never quite fall the way you expect them, and they're not necessarily in a kind of, in a kind of regular groove. So sort of that added to what he'd learned from Mio. That sort of gave him, well, that was one of the things that sort of gave him the idea about using time in this way. And then also when he was touring, he did a famous tour in '58, a sort of state-sponsored a tour into Eastern Europe, and behind the red curtain. And when he was in Istanbul, he heard this, he heard this rhythm in 9/8, or at least he thought of it in 9/8, which was 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3, which again is a, it's a fascinating sort of asymmetrical rhythm that kind of you expect it to be a clear 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2, but there's a extra beat at the end. So he sort of, he put all these ideas together and came up with a Time Out. And there was a similar thing with harmony. Again, Mio, one of Mio's sort of expertise was a polytonality and bitonality, which simply means putting different keys together, and immediately you put different keys together. There's a kind of tension in the harmony. There's a kind of, it's a bit like putting two colors together in a color spectrum. They kind of rub against each other. And Dave was very inspired by Mio to do that. And he found if you took a standard like, a Sweet Georgia Brown or a Body and Soul, and you put sort of polytonal harmonies in it, it kind of clawed up and at the structure, it kind of opened it up into kind of fresh, into a kind of fresh thing for exploration. Mm-hmm. So that was, that was the basis of the idea. And your question, I think you asked about how listeners are supposed to perceive this, and is that right, or is it more nuanced other than that?
Well, what I'm thinking is, as I was, listening to, as I was putting questions together.
Yeah.
For someone who's just a listener, is it demanding music? Like bebop came along, and a lot of it is very beautiful, but a lot of it is almost challenging in its nature. And I think I put too much into that first question, so I apologize for that.
No, that's fine. I know. Well, no, it's an interesting question with Dave, because on the surface, it's very non-threatening. A tune like It's a Raggy Waltz, or a Three to Get Ready. Three to Get Ready, could almost be a kind of Haydn, a minuet, and It's a Raggy Waltz is a very sort of jaunty tune. But I mean, the fascinating sort of tension within Dave's music is that there is that side of the music that is very appealing, extremely charming. You put on Time Out and you're immediately sort of drawn into the sound of Paul Desmond's saxophone, and
right.
And it's a very, it kind of smiles at you at the music often. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing is, often in Dave's solos, you wonder how a musician who has soloed in that manner, became so popular, because there are times he just leaves the kind of the harmony of the piece behind and goes into into the sort of wild beyond his often his sort of chords and harmonies are incredibly dense, and and he's not that interested as sometimes in sort of sticking with the rhythm section. He's quite happy to go off into the beyond. So it's a kind of it's a sort of it's a fascinating plurality, really, and it and it comes from if your thing is putting together ideas that don't necessarily blend or fuse, then of course the thing isn't going to kind of sit sort of comfortably over a groove. It's like it's like if you put kind of strawberries and nuts and soup in a pan, it's not going to be a kind of it isn't going to be like a sort of smooth blend. It's going to be sort of a bumpy and awkward. Yeah. And that's kind of great. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't see why music has to be neat. Music can be sort of music. Often I think music is fantastic if it doesn't quite work, whatever work means, if it's a bit sort of messy. Right. And Dave, Dave sort of reveled in putting things that together that under normal circumstances that nobody else I would have thought to have put together. And he often in his solos he'd introduce one idea, another idea, and then sort of try and sort of negotiate between them. And it's and there's a sort of sometimes it's a sort of rocky ride, and they never quite reconcile, and at other times they just suddenly kind of snap, and become at the same thing. And both of those were equally acceptable to him, actually.
You explain it very, very well, and it is I think I was really again when I started reading the bio, it's like I said, it was like I thought I was reading. My son was a math major at Pitt, and I thought it was almost like I was looking at one of his papers. I'm going to skip over most of the kind of purely biographical elements. If folks are interested, they could. I hear there's a great new book out about all of that. But there are a couple of high level things. In general, did he have to work hard to get people to believe in his music, or was the acceptance and the fame that comes with it comparatively easily achieved to some other musicians?
No, I mean, he worked incredibly hard. I mean, he, eventually he became obviously incredibly successful and incredibly wealthy. And I don't know if you've seen at the house he had commissioned in Connecticut has just gone up for sale in the last week. It was finished in 1963 in Wilton, and it's the most extraordinary house. And I mean, obviously he became incredibly wealthy and successful. But I mean, at the beginning, no, I mean, not at all. His first group was an octet that I think they played about sort of 2 jobs in over 3 years. They sort of they played in sort of Chinese restaurants in San Francisco, and they played they would play a couple of tunes and get kind of kicked out, and they go in sort of a 1 week as the Dave Brubeck octet, and and get kicked out and turn up a few weeks later as the Bill Smith octet, because Bill Smith was Dave's a clarinetist, and the same thing would happen. So that period was was extremely rough, and it started to become a bit easier when a local disc jockey called Jimmy Lyons, who had a kind of radio, he had a syndicated radio program. He started taking interest in the Brubeck group. This isn't the Jimmy Lyons, the saxophonist who played with Cecil Taylor. This was a different Jimmy Lyons, just to make that clear. And Jimmy Lyons started to take an interest in Dave, and he tried to get an audition.
I'm sorry, I apologize for interrupting. Was he here in New York, or was he?
Oh no, so he was on the West Coast.
Okay.
Yeah, he was the guy who eventually went on to found at the Monterey Jazz Festival. So he was a big deal on the West Coast at the time. A very, an incredibly influential figure in West Coast jazz. And he tried to get an audition for the octet with is it NBC? Yes, NBC, I think. And they simply said, we can't afford, even if the audition is a success, we just can't afford 8 musicians. So Dave stripped it back to a trio, sort of him, bass and a drummer called Cal Jada, who also doubled on a vibraphone. And that was, that was the first, sort of inkling of a success. Sort of Dave Brubeck, a small group, and they started to get, sort of club dates and regular, a regular work.
Mm-hmm. Now I know, a seminal event in the life and career of Bob Dylan was his motorcycle accident.
Mm.
And along the same lines, it seems, in 1951, Brubeck broke his neck surfing in Hawaii and almost died.
Yeah.
Thank goodness he didn't die. But what my understanding is, there was some long-term impact in actually how he physically played the piano. That and also what physical issues might have emerged from that accident, and emotional scars. Obviously, I mean, if you almost die.
I think. I mean, certainly in terms of his piano playing, he simply, I mean, he was in traction for months, and he was very, his back was incredibly stiff, and his back pain went on for right into the 1970s, and I think he said there was one day in the 1970s he woke up and it had suddenly gone for whatever reason, but so this back pain, this sort of chronic back pain went on for sort of 20 odd years, and what it meant was he simply couldn't do the kind of fluid, sort of linear stuff he'd been doing before, simply because I guess doing that sort of action, it just sort of hurt basically.
Right.
So that, I mean, he was already into this idea of sort of block harmonies. If you listen to records before the accident, he's very much using block chord, but the accident sort of forced his hand, but forced his hands quite literally to just simply, he had to compensate, and he was very interested in block chords, and simply. And they simply, sort of went with that and exploited it and built her solos out of block chords, rather than these, these sort of linear things that it was painful to do. And sometimes, I mean, there were times at gigs, particularly in the, in the kind of aftermath of the accident, in the immediate aftermath. He'd finish a set and he simply couldn't get up from the chair. He was in so much pain, and he had to actually be sort of helped up off the chair. And there was a point, I mean, much later in his career, when suddenly he stopped sitting in concerts on a piano stool. He had to have a chair with a back on it, and I guess I guess it came back later when he got older. But I mean, it was a desperate situation. They were him and his family were in Florida, and they were, this was another club job which had got him out of financial dire straits, and everything was going very nicely, and then sort of bang, he had his accident, and him and his family were kind of stranded in Florida, and sort of Dave in hospital, and no money coming in, and so it was a desperate situation, and they were sort of stranded there for, I can't quite remember, but sort of 2 or 3 months until Dave recovered. And well, he didn't recover, but he recovered sufficiently to go home. And then he was told they couldn't fly home because the sort of jolt of the aeroplane would potentially inflict a damage on his back. So they had to go home on a. And also another thing that happened was that the day they went, they booked a sailing the ship, sort of back. Yeah. And the day they were gonna go, his eldest son, Darius, had got bitten by, I think it was a locust or something, and his sort of body was sort of swelling up everywhere. And they went back to the hospital where Dave had just been released from, and this nurse had put this kind of horrible kind of sticky brown fluid all over Darius's body, and sort of wrapped him up in this in these bandages, and apparently they sort of sat on the boat all the way back stinking of this brown stuff, and everyone avoided them on the boat. So they got back home and thought, gosh, that's really been, as a disasters go, that whole trip has been has been a complete disaster.
Unbelievable. I'm glad there's nothing worse than back pain. And I, don't have a bad back, and I still don't understand why they sit on those dopey benches when they play piano. I mean, just get a chair.
Yeah, well.
Now, who was Paul Desmond? And more broadly, obviously Desmond wrote probably, almost certainly, the most popular, well-known tune, "Take Five," that from Brubeck. Who was Desmond, and was it a long-term musical relationship, or are those two names linked so closely just because Desmond wrote "Take Five"?
Well, Desmond was born in San Francisco. He was an alto saxophone player, and he wasn't a part of Dave. I studied at Mills College with Darius and Mio after the war, and Desmond wasn't a pupil of Mio, but he was sort of he was sort of in the peripheries of San Francisco, and one of Mio's pupils who was studying at the same time as Dave, a tenor, a player called David Van Crete, knew Paul Desmond, and that was how sort of Desmond came into Brubeck's orbit. And Desmond was part of the original octet, and then they had Dave and Paul had a big falling out over Dave felt that Desmond had sort of poached his gig, basically. Dave agreed to play with Paul as a sideman for half the money of his own gig, and then Desmond took another job and sort of left Dave stranded, and had a huge falling out. I won't go into it all because it's quite complicated and it's in the book, but that's the outline. And then, the Dave Brubeck trio happened, and Paul heard their records and really liked them, and basically begged Dave if he could, if the Dave Brubeck trio could become the Dave Brubeck quartet. And he sort of learned all the trio charts and sort of devised his own alto saxophone parts, and would actually occasionally he would turn up at trio at gigs and sit in for no money, just to show sort of Dave, what could happen. And then it was actually in the aftermath of the swimming accident, which you mentioned, eventually Dave realized that, because of his physical injuries, to sort of carry a whole gig by himself was actually a bit of a challenge. And, sort of Paul had sort of atoned for his sins in a way, and he decided to bring, Paul in, and also Dave's wife, Iola, who was incredibly astute. As she realized, I think there was a kind of Dave and Paul, kind of magic there. She kind of, I think she heard things very clearly. And I think she also, persuaded Dave, that, actually, well, even if you took the swimming accident out of the equation for a second, sort of, the Dave Paul thing was a good thing, but certainly in the circumstances, it made sense to expand the trio to a quartet, and therefore Paul joined, and the first quartet recordings that were made in '51. And immediately, there's a sense with, sort of Dave and Paul. I mean, it's become a real sort of a Brubeck, a Desmond cliche to say there was sort of, Paul was the light and Dave was the shade. But there's a certain sort of a truth in that. Sort of Dave had this sort of light, sort of a floaty, almost like a sort of flute-like tone, which he brought to the quartet. And Dave's approach was sort of much more muscular.
Did they end up being okay with each other? Was
no. I mean, more than they became. They became incredibly close. I mean, they were completely different personalities. Paul I got married and then got a divorced and sort of had, you know, sort of strings of relationships. I was once with, I mean, the book is based around you know, a tour, a Brubeck a quartet tour in 2003, and I shadowed the group for 10 days. And at one of the gigs, this very elegant lady turned up, and she was introduced as Paul's British girlfriend. So even, you know, even all those years later, you know, wherever they went, there was you know, there was a sort of Desmond, a girlfriend. And of course, Dave was married, you know, to Iola for, you know, for decades and decades.
So this is the end of part 1 of this interview with Phil Clark, and please watch the second part, which should be down below on your screen or somehow indicated in the post that accompanies this.